The rain came down like a symphony of grief, each droplet striking the steel rails of the bridge with the precision of a metronome marking time for a requiem. Chicago's skyline blurred in the distance, swallowed by a curtain of silver mist, its brilliance muted beneath the weight of the storm. Streetlights trembled in the wind, and the river below churned with restless fury, its dark current reflecting the chaos in Ethan Caldwell's heart. He stood motionless at the center of the Michigan Avenue Bridge, his coat clinging to his frame, soaked through by the relentless downpour. The world had become a monochrome painting, black, white, and the thousand shades of gray that dwell in between. Behind him, traffic honked and hissed, but the sound barely reached him. The city kept moving, indifferent to his stillness, to the storm inside him that no umbrella could ever shield. His father's funeral had been 3 days ago. 3 days since the man who had built an empire from dust, who had demanded brilliance, discipline, and control, had been lowered into the earth. And yet, not a single tear had come. Not in the church, not by the graveside. Ethan had delivered the eulogy in perfect composure, every syllable crafted with the precision of a man who had learned that emotions were flaws to be managed, not expressed. But now, under the storm's quiet mercy, his facade began to fracture. Rain ran down his face, cold and merciless. He closed his eyes, but behind his eyelids he saw his father's gaze, stern, proud, always expecting more. He had spent his life trying to live up to that gaze, to become the son his father wanted. And yet, as he stood there alone, he realized he didn't even know what enough had ever meant. He had everything, the company, the penthouse, the accolades. But grief had a way of stripping away illusion, leaving only truth behind. And the truth was this: Ethan Caldwell, golden boy of Chicago's tech elite, felt utterly, painfully empty. A gust of wind tore through the bridge, nearly snatching the umbrella from a passerby hurrying in the opposite direction. Ethan barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the water below, on the violent rhythm of waves breaking against the concrete supports. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if the storm was mourning too, if the city itself grieved with him. It was a foolish thought, but it was the only one that made sense. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice was soft, not timid but deliberate, like a melody cutting through noise. Ethan turned slightly startled. A woman stood a few feet away, her umbrella tilted against the wind. She wasn't dressed for the weather, no expensive coat, no designer shoes, just a simple navy dress and boots darkened by rain. Her skin glowed with warmth against the storm's cold palette, and her eyes, they were steady, clear, unafraid. She wasn't smiling, but there was kindness in the way she looked at him, as if she saw the storm not around him, but within him. Most people wouldn't call this beautiful, Ethan said quietly, his voice roughened by disuse. Most people don't stop to look long enough, she replied. Her tone was calm, unhurried, the voice of someone who wasn't intimidated by silence. Ethan studied her, unsure whether to be irritated or intrigued. He had become used to being recognized, to the polished deference that came with his name. But there was none of that here. No recognition, no awe, just a stranger talking to him like he was anyone else standing in the rain. "You'll catch a cold out here," he said at last, more out of habit than concern. "So will you," she countered gently, "but somehow, I don't think that's what's keeping you here." For the first time in weeks, Ethan's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "You read people often?" She shrugged. "Only the ones who look like they're trying not to break." The words hit deeper than she could have known. Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced a breath through the ache. "Maybe I came out here to remember how to feel something." "Then maybe," she said softly, "you already are." For a long moment, they simply stood there, the storm moving around them, two strangers bound by silence. Then she shifted her umbrella slightly, angling it so the edge covered part of his shoulder. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it was the first warmth he had felt in days. "Naomi," she said finally, as if offering a secret. "Naomi Carter." He hesitated. "Ethan." "I know," she said, meeting his eyes with quiet certainty. "But tonight, maybe you don't have to be Ethan Caldwell." And then she smiled, a soft, fleeting curve of her lips that lingered longer than it should have. Before he could reply, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain's shimmering veil. Ethan stood there long after she was gone, staring into the mist where her silhouette had vanished. The sound of the river rose and fell like a heartbeat, steady and sure. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere beneath the storm, something had shifted. Not enough to change everything, not yet, but enough to make him want to look up again. The rain softened to a silvery hush, like the city had lowered its voice to listen. Traffic thinned, footsteps scattered, umbrellas tilted and bobbed across the riverwalk like dark blossoms adrift on a current of wind. Naomi Carter slowed near the midpoint of the bridge, feeling the storm's edge graze her cheeks, and paused at the sight of a man standing at the rail. Not a tableau of danger, not a cry for help, just the unmistakable stillness of someone trying to hold himself together. She knew that face. Not intimately, not beyond headlines and photographs. A CEO whose photo was often framed by stock tickers and splashy profiles. Ethan Caldwell, the kind of name that came with a skyline behind it. Yet the man before her seemed smaller than the articles made him. Smaller not in presence, but in the way a person can be when grief has carved out a quiet room inside them. Naomi lifted her umbrella and stepped to his side, her shoulder angled toward the river's breath. She offered him half the shelter without comment. He didn't thank her, not immediately. He only tipped his head the slightest degree, as if words were too heavy for a mouth unwilling to lose its hold on composure. "They say the lake decides Chicago's moods," she said at last, voice low, almost conversational. "But I think the river keeps the secrets." Ethan's eyes flitted from water to sky, then to her. He was paler up close, handsome in an accidental way, the kind that emerged when a face had run out of defenses. "What kind of secrets?" "The ones that are easier to tell a current than a person," she said. "Currents don't talk back." A corner of his mouth moved, something between a grimace and an almost smile. Rain struck the umbrella with the delicate insistence of fingertips on a drum. For a breath or two, Naomi let the weather speak in their stead. She had learned, in boardrooms and family kitchens alike, that silence was a language of its own. Sometimes the only one that reached where it hurt. "I know who you are," she said then, gentle, as if placing a fragile object on a table. "But I'd rather not talk to your reputation." His gaze sharpened, wary and curious at once. "Who would you like to talk to?" "The man who chose to stand in the rain instead of a room full of condolences," she answered. "The one who came out here because the storm made sense." The line was not rehearsed. It arrived in her like a truth discovered, not crafted. He exhaled, a sound that was almost relief. "I find I have nothing useful to say to condolences." "Of course not," Naomi replied. "Condolences are for the mouths of the living, not for the place where the dead used to be." He turned toward her fully now, searching her face as if she were a page that might explain him to himself. She did not look away. Up close, she saw the ghost of a sleepless week along his jaw, the pink seam at the rim of his eyes that had nothing to do with rain. He was, she realized, not an intimidating figure, but a complicated one, like a skyscraper built over an old foundation, every steel beam held by something older, more human, beneath it. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naomi," she said. "Naomi Carter. Thank you for the umbrella, Naomi Carter." "You're welcome, Ethan." He blinked. "You already knew my name." "Yes, but it's different when a person offers it." The answer unhooked something in him. He glanced toward the water again, and the city lights found room in his eyes. "My father didn't leave room for much. Offering. He preferred assignments, blueprints." "And did he draw yours?" "Every line," he said, then paused. "Or maybe I traced them because it was easier than learning my own hand." There was no accusation in the words, only the weary honesty of someone who had finally noticed the map in his pocket wasn't a landscape, but a script. Naomi shifted her stance, feeling the ache of wind in her coat, the damp that had crept into the hem of her dress. The cold brought clarity. The clarity wanted kindness. "My mother used to say," she told him, "grief is a heavy coat. You don't take it off by pretending you aren't wearing it. You hang it up when you get home, and until then, you let kind people hold the door." He considered that, rain ticking like small clocks above them. "And you? Who holds the door for you?" "Strangers," she said simply. When they remember we all live in the same weather. A long, soft quiet followed. The river shouldered past its stone banks. Somewhere a siren rose and fell, the sound blurring into distance. Ethan eased his hands from his pockets and braced them on the rail, as if the metal could ground him. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into the register where true things reside. "I didn't cry at the funeral," he confessed. "You don't owe tears to a room," Naomi said. "They're not currency." "I thought that made me cold." "It makes you a son in shock," she replied. "There's a difference." He turned that over, and something in his posture eased. The subtle release in his shoulder, the loosening of his jaw. The storm had shifted again. The rain threaded finer, more like mist. Naomi lowered the umbrella a fraction so she could feel it on her cheeks. She had always liked weather that put the city at eye level, made gods and titles irrelevant, left only people and their breath. "Why did you come over?" he asked finally. No puzzle in it, only wonder. "Because you looked like the quiet kind of lonely," she said. "The kind that doesn't make a scene but still needs company." Ethan's mouth wanted another almost smile and nearly reached it. "And you're the kind of person who keeps company with strangers." "I'm the kind of person who recognizes a bridge when she sees one," she answered. "Sometimes it's a structure. Sometimes it's a moment." He looked at her as if the ribcage had just remembered its purpose. For a brief, bright second, Naomi saw the boy he had been, the one who might have loved thunderstorms, who might have found patterns in clouds and names for shadows. Then the man returned, composed, cautious, grateful in the private way of those who are learning to receive. A tour boat ghosted under them, its lights pearling the river into silk. Ethan watched it go. "If I asked you to tell me one true thing that isn't about work," he said, "could you?" Naomi nodded. "I fall asleep best to jazz on low, not because it's soothing, but because it remembers pain and still makes beauty." He breathed out a laugh, and this time it was a smile. "One true thing about me," he offered. "I used to fix broken radios as a kid. Not for the challenge, for the moment when static became a voice." They let the parallel sit between them, the invisible wire humming softly. Then Naomi angled the umbrella back toward him, and he stepped closer, noting, touching, not even brushing, close enough that they shared weather without stealing space. "I should go," she said after a time, though neither of them moved. "You should get warm. Hot shower, bad television, something without a script that matters. Will I see you again?" The question came out before he could vet it, as if the boy had asked first, and the man had to live with it. Naomi's eyes held his. "Chicago isn't large when a city remembers your name, but I don't think it should be left to chance." He waited. "There's a cafe on State in Huron," she said. "Corner window, blue tiles. Mornings I'm there when the barista forgets to play anything but Coltrane. If you want to try listening for a voice in the static." "Tomorrow?" "Not a blueprint," she cautioned, and softened it with a smile. "But possible." She folded the umbrella before stepping away, letting the rain reclaim her. The storm had grown tender, a curtain drawing rather than a punishment. Ethan watched her until the city took her into its weave. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. The river kept its secrets. The lights stitched them to the night. When he finally turned toward home, the weight in his chest had not vanished, but it had shifted, redistributing itself around the small, unfamiliar shape of relief. A stranger had met him as a man, not a mogul. And in the meeting, something true had been witnessed. The first quiet rumor of a connection, beginning not in triumph but in weather, not in declarations, but in the simple mercy of shared shelter. Weeks slipped by like pages turned in a book Naomi hadn't decided to keep. Work filled the spaces where uncertainty might have taken root. She let numbers anchor her, let schedules make a lattice strong enough to climb. The city thawed and then iced again. The lake changed moods, and the river kept its secrets. Somewhere in that measured passage, an invitation arrived, heavy cardstock, deep indigo ink, requesting the pleasure of her attendance at the Caldwell Foundation's Winter Gala. She told herself she was going for the firm. Her name would be on the badge beneath the logo she had helped steady through volatile quarters. Her presence would soothe clients, open a door or two. It had nothing to do with a bridge in the rain or the way a stranger had held silence like a kindness. Nothing at all. The ballroom breathed opulence. Chandeliers descended like captured constellations. each crystal a patient star. Mirrored columns multiplied the light until it seemed the room could outshine the city. On the mezzanine, a jazz quartet coaxed velvet from brass, crooning something old enough to remember ache and new enough to make it worth dancing anyway. Servers moved in quiet currents, silver trays hovering above the tide of silk and wool. Naomi smoothed the navy dress she'd chosen for its clean lines and honest fabric. It wasn't a dress that pretended it belonged. It was a dress that said she did not require permission. Still, the first steps into that layered glitter felt like entering a language where she knew the words, but not the accent. Faces turned and returned to their circles. Laughter sparked at the edges of conversation, a choreography learned by years of practice. The right names, the right nods, the right distance. Julian found her near the floral installation, a walled garden of winter branches and white roses. "You look like conviction," he said, and it was his way of telling her she looked beautiful. She smiled, grateful. "Stay, or I'll abandon you to the donors. I'll orbit," he promised, "and rescue you every third lap." The first hour passed on cues. She accepted small talk the way one accepts canapes, politely, without mistaking it for sustenance. Clients drifted by, warm in urbanity, delighted to connect a result to the woman who'd moved the numbers. More than once, a gaze lingered a fraction too long, not unkindly, but with the curiosity that follows an outlier into rooms like these. Naomi let it slide off her like rain. She had practice at that. When she finally lifted her eyes to the dais, she saw him not as a headline, but as a composition. Ethan Caldwell in a black tuxedo cut with severe kindness, beneath a wash of chandelier light that made his hair appear a shade warmer. He was speaking to a trustee, head bent the way men bend when they try to be heard without seeming to take. The sight struck her with the gentle jolt of a memory arriving unannounced. The bridge, the hush of rain, the way his voice had found its true register when he admitted he hadn't cried. As if hearing a thought pass through him, he looked up. The room kept moving, but the space between them did something else. It narrowed. She saw recognition flash and soften into something more careful. She felt her own features answer, not a smile so much as a loosening, a permission granted to her own face to be honest for a second. Across 20 feet of marble and manners, they greeted each other without words. "Naomi." Margaret Caldwell's voice came from her right, polished and precise, a violin tuned tight. "We're so grateful for your firm's insight this quarter. Your analysis turned a thorny case into a commendable one." Naomi turned and met the older woman's smile, the kind that held at the corners but not the eyes. Margaret wore silver the way some people wore certainty. "Thank you," Naomi replied. "It's a privilege to contribute to work that matters." "It does matter," Margaret agreed, "which is why one must attend to optics with the same care as outcomes. I'm sure you understand." She let the sentence hang, pleasant and barbed, then touched Naomi's elbow as if blessing her. "Enjoy." The quartet shifted into a slow standard. Naomi moved to the edge of the room, where glass opened onto a terrace and the city breathed beyond. She stood a moment, collecting herself, watching her reflection double against the night like a woman deciding between two lives. "Is this seat taken?" Ethan's voice came quiet from behind, close enough to reach without startling. She turned. He had crossed the room without ceremony, without escort, a simple thing, and therefore brave. Up close, the tuxedo became a man again. He looked rested, but only in the way that follows exhaustion. There was a new steadiness at the center of him, a thread drawn taut and true. "It wasn't," she said. "It is now." He took the position beside her that left a respectful inch of air. For a while, neither of them spoke. Through the glass, the skyline smoldered. Below, a valet line glanced with taillights like a ribbon of rubies. Inside, laughter rose and fell on cue. The world of appearances performed its ballet, flawless and relentless. "You belong to this room better than I do," Ethan said finally. She huffed a small breath that might have been a laugh. "That's a trick of lighting." "It isn't," he said, and the statement was so simply offered that she almost believed it. "I've learned to navigate." He nodded toward the clusters. "You, translate." She glanced at him. "And what do I make of this tonight?" "That depends," he said, "on whether you're seeing what's required or what's true." What's required is easy, she said. Shake hands. Say the names. Pretend the crystal means clarity. And what's true? She let herself answer. You're here because your father's name could fund a wing, and because your own could turn it into a strategy. But you're looking at the door as if there's air out there you can't find in here. He did not deny it. When it's loud enough, silence starts to look like oxygen. She allowed the next truth entry. I went to the bridge again. Once. After that night. His head turned. Did you? I thought if I stood where the river listens, I'd understand why I agreed to come tonight. She lifted a shoulder. Maybe I do. What did it say? That grief doesn't cancel grace, she said lightly, and that sometimes showing up is a kind of courage. He was quiet. Then, will you dance with me? She looked down at the floor where couples orbited under the night's choreography, each smile calibrated, each gesture polished by repetition. The music was tender, but it played to a performance. Still, she could feel the invitation offered as a bridge, not a stage. In there? She asked, tilting her chin toward the center, where donors drifted in curated joy. He followed her glance. No. He nodded toward the terrace doors. Out here. They stepped through the glass into the cool. The city wrapped them in a different kind of audience. Windows, wind, the thrum of a train in the distance. The quartet's melody thinned as it traveled, turning private the further it went. Ethan extended a hand without insistence. Naomi placed her palm in his, surprised by the quiet ease of it. No cameras, no choreography, just the sound of their breath, the silk of her dress brushing his sleeve, the weight of his hand solicitous at the edge of her shoulder blade. They moved, barely more than a sway, but the motion contained something the ballroom could not. Sincerity. He did not guide her so much as keep company with her balance. She did not follow so much as consent to share it. Inside, Crystal shattered into applause. Outside, a siren stitched the avenue and vanished. Your mother spoke with me, Naomi said, and let the words be what they were. I suspected she might, Ethan answered, tone even. She cares about the shape of things. And you? I care about what fills the shape. They slowed to stillness. For a moment they stood very near and very separate, the honesty of it almost holy. The terrace light drew a faint halo on the stone. The river, somewhere behind the buildings, kept moving. Thank you for coming, he said, and she heard the double meaning. To the gala, to the edge of his life where the private truth waited for air. Thank you for asking, she returned, though he hadn't. Not aloud anyway. From inside, someone opened a door. Laughter spilled and receded. A draft pushed a loose curl against Naomi's cheek. Without thinking, Ethan lifted his hand, stopped halfway and drew it back. A reverence that felt more intimate than any touch. They looked at one another as if they were reading, line by line, a poem neither had the right to claim, and both had earned the right to keep. Then she stepped back, giving the space its distance again. He nodded, accepting the boundary like a man grateful for its mercy, rather than insulted by its presence. The ballroom reclaimed them, gilded, glittering, exacting. They walked in side by side but not together, each bearing their own weather. Across the room, Margaret's smile held, diamond hard. Julian lifted 2 fingers in the small sign that meant he was watching without interfering. The chandeliers kept their constellations. The night performed its script. But somewhere beneath the measured light, a different scene had begun. 2 truths exchanging names under the guise of a gala. A dance invisible to everyone who needed the crystal to stand for clarity. The gala's second act unfolded with the practiced ease of a play that had outlived its author. Speeches dwindled to toasts. Toasts dissolved into laughter, and laughter softened into the steady hum of deals being floated along with champagne bubbles. From the mezzanine, where mirrored panels multiplied the room into a kaleidoscope of composure, Naomi watched the choreography continue without her. The chandeliers trembled with music. Silverware chimed in polite conversation. Pride and charity wore the same cut of silk. She stood near a wall of glass that gave the city back to itself. Windows reflecting windows, light folding into light. Chicago arranging and rearranging its posture as if embarrassed by its own grandeur. Her breath ghosted the surface in soft ellipses before vanishing. She liked the glass for its honest duplicity. It both revealed and hid. Both returned her face and denied it a place to land. Too bright, isn't it? Ethan's voice arrived beside her, pitched to a register that belonged to confidences, not announcements. He had crossed to her without entourage, one hand tucked in his pocket, as if to remind himself not to reach for anything he had not been offered. The tuxedo fit him like a promise he'd stopped trying to keep. Depends on what needs to be seen, Naomi replied, not turning at once. Some truths prefer shade, and some mistakes, he said, prefer chandeliers. She glanced at him then, at the careful humor, at the sober eyes that held it in check. Up close, he seemed less lacquered by the room's demands, more human in the quiet fatigue that bracketed his mouth. The band slid into a standard that had lived several lives before tonight. It knew how to be beautiful in the presence of disappointment. For instance, he murmured, I've been circulating for an hour to find an excuse for this conversation. I thought CEOs didn't require excuses, she said. I'm not a CEO at the moment, he answered, and the simplicity cleared a space between them. I'm a man who hasn't stopped thinking about a bridge in the rain. The line could have been heavy, he carried it lightly. Naomi's lips curved despite herself. She angled toward him, careful of distance, careful of everything. You should know, she said. I'm unreliable at small talk and worse at pleasantries. That's precisely the point, he said, a near smile that didn't betray the restraint he guarded. Everyone else here is excellent at both. They stood side by side, facing their reflections as though the glass were a third presence mediating the conversation. Their faces lived on the surface. Two figures framed by chandeliers, almost plausible in that world. Behind the overlay, the city lay patient and uncurated. What do you see? He asked softly, nodding toward the double image. When you look at this, a room full of people rehearsed past sincerity, she answered, and two who haven't learned the steps. Is that a criticism? It's an alibi. He let the words settle. Somewhere behind them, polite applause rose and fell like the tide. Nathaniel, one of his trustees, laughed too loudly at a joke he hadn't heard. A donor's diamond flashed like a signal to a ship that would never arrive. My mother speaks highly of your work, he said after a beat. Naomi kept her gaze on the glass. Your mother speaks highly of optics. He took that in without offense. Margaret believes the shape of virtue is as important as its substance. And you? I prefer vessels that can hold water, he said, even when the room isn't looking. Silence pressed close again, not as an absence but as an instrument tuned to their pulse. In their reflection, they seemed almost to lean toward each other, though in fact they stood a measured span apart. Naomi traced a fingertip along the seam where brass met glass, feeling the faint vibration of the band's bass through the frame. Restraint, she knew, was only dangerous when it pretended to be indifference. Tonight it felt like a vow against harm. Why are you here, Ethan? She asked. At this pain, I mean. Not for the foundation, not for the cameras. Here. Because I don't want to confuse power for intimacy, he said. And this glass helps me remember the difference. She turned to look at him fully, at the work in that statement, at the risk. He stayed where he was, as if he understood the geometry of trust and would not shorten an angle uninvited. You should know something about me, she said quietly. I have no interest in becoming a story told about a woman at a charitable event. I have no interest in authoring one, he replied. Their reflections seemed to nod before their actual bodies did. The room warmed a degree, or perhaps the conversation had found enough honesty to conduct heat. Across the floor, Margaret watched. She did not stare. She observed, the way a strategist reads a board she designed. Her jaw flexed once, an almost invisible hinge beneath flawless poise. She saw the angle of Ethan's body, how his shoulders had found a slope they used to find only at home, how his hands behaved as though they could be gentle without instruction. Margaret's smile didn't falter. It brightened. The chandeliers loved the diamond's answer. Naomi sensed the glance without seeing it. Years in rooms like this had taught her the science of peripheral weather. She's looking, she said, not unkindly. She has spent a lifetime looking, he answered. It's how she believes she keeps me safe. And does she? From some things, he said. A breath, almost a laugh. Not from myself. Naomi's throat tightened with a sympathy she guarded from performance. Safety is expensive when it costs permission. He tipped his head. You have a way of naming the bill. And you, she returned, have a way of offering to pay it without checking your balance. They nearly smiled. Restraint held. The band's trumpet reached for a high note and thought better of it. "What would you ask?" he said then, "if we were two strangers at a cafe and not two targets in a field of magnifying glasses?" "I'd ask what you're like when you're not required to be admired." "And I'd ask," he answered, "who you are when no one needs you to be reliable." She nodded, pleased by the symmetry. "I cook too much for one person. I read poetry before bed and fall asleep on line breaks. I like the sound of trains that I'm not riding. And I am never less reliable than when a saxophone remembers a wound." His eyes warmed, then gentled, as if the city had dimmed a fraction to hear. "I fix things past fixing. I memorize quiet streets. I own 3 radios I don't turn on. I keep them for the promise of static becoming a human voice." Their reflections blurred with the faint film of breath the glass collected from their closeness. They did not lift a hand to wipe it away. It felt like the most honest thing in the room. Behind them, Margaret adjusted the fall of her shawl and moved closer to a trustee, proximity serving as punctuation. She did not interrupt. She took note, the hinge of her jaw smoothed, but the knuckles around her clutch whitened just enough to polish the leather. "Ethan," Naomi said, almost whispering, as if the chandeliers had ears, "there's something in me that doesn't go where it isn't safe." "And there's something in me," he returned, same softness, "that won't ask you to." He stepped back half a pace, a deliberate offering of space that felt like an old-fashioned courtesy disguised as modern wisdom. The axe steadied the floor beneath them. The room, having pretended not to notice, was satisfied. "Tomorrow," he said after a moment, careful, unassuming, "the cafe with blue tiles." "Possibility," she said, the word a small lamp between them. They turned slightly, angling themselves back into the flux. The glass returned them to the ballroom, their faces reassuming the neutrality that wouldn't invite inquiry. He would orbit his donors. She would find Julian and the winter roses. They would do as the night requested. But the pain had done its work. In that narrow margin between reflection and view, they had left a print that only the city could read. As they parted, the band risked the high note and landed it. A smatter of applause rose, unknowing and on time. Margaret lifted her glass to no one in particular, and her smile, crystalline and exact, did not crack. Only her eyes tightened by a hair's breadth, the smallest weather change over a strategy map, before smoothing into forecast. Naomi crossed the floor with an ease she had earned. Ethan moved the other way, shook the hands that needed shaking, said the names that needed saying. Between them, the chandelier light fell in deliberate fragments, like blessings someone had broken into pieces small enough to carry. The night returned to its opera of polished certainties, but the glass, cool, patient, complicit, held the ghost of 2 breaths, side by side, and the outline of a distance respected so that something truer might dare to approach. The first call came at 10:43, when the city's offices had gone dark and the river wore the lights like a soft necklace. It was meant to be about a funding pipeline, timelines, contingencies, the choreography that turns generosity into durable outcomes. Naomi answered with her usual poise, notes open, mind clear. Ethan kept to the agenda, voice measured, courteous. They ended at 11:09 with an agreement, and 2 quiet seconds that neither filled before the line clicked to stillness. The second call was the next night, later. He apologized for the hour. She said late was fine if the work was honest. He laughed under his breath, a sound that wanted to be relief, and stayed with the numbers long enough to earn the right to stray. It was Naomi who changed the angle first, almost without meaning to, asking why the Foundation's endowment spoke so loudly about growth and so softly about access. Ethan paused for a beat that held more than consideration. "You're asking if we build ladders or rooftops," he said. "I'm asking who gets to climb without permission," she replied. It became the shape of their nights, scaffolding of spreadsheets with conversations threaded through like warm wire. He called from his kitchen, jacket gone, sleeves rolled, the good glass forgotten in favor of an old mug that made coffee taste like a memory. She answered from her small desk by the window, the blue tiles of the cafe a daytime echo in her lamp's glow. Chicago hummed beneath them both, distant, patient, as if the city approved of work that wore tenderness like a hidden lining. They did not flirt, not at first, not exactly. They asked large questions in careful voices. Naomi spoke of neighborhoods where philanthropy arrived like weather, blessing some corners, skipping others, and of programs that required too much proof from those who had spent a lifetime proving their existence. Ethan listened, an unfamiliar muscle burning as it strengthened. He told her how the board measured impact with clean shapes and tidy graphs. She told him how lives insist on curves. He did not bristle. He asked for examples, for names, for failures. She gave them, unembarrassed by the mess of truth. At 1 in the morning on a Wednesday that thought it was Thursday, she said, "Your data set loves distance." "What do you mean?" "It applauds what it can count from afar," Naomi said, "but standing close changes what you think you're measuring." Silence, then the creak of a chair as he leaned back. "Close is complicated. Complicated is honest," she said, softer. Something inside him tilted toward that word, as if it were a compass. He admitted, almost shyly, that his father had taught him to trust elevation, see the city whole, design for the sweep, avoid the drag of one story demanding to be the center. Naomi did not argue. She simply asked what might happen if a story, singular and stubborn, altered a sweep for the better. He could hear her smile when she said it. He found himself smiling too, alone in his kitchen. A man who had spent years perfecting policies and had forgotten the way a question could be an embrace. They learned each other's midnights. He discovered she brewed tea as if it were ceremony, counting breaths between pour and sip. She discovered he scribbled in margins with a fierce, slanted hand, as if arguments had to be chased to be caught. He confessed to repairing a decades-old radio on weekends, only to leave it silent when it finally worked. The triumph was in the possibility, not the noise. She confessed that on heavy days she fell asleep to Coltrane because the horn told her sorrow didn't disqualify beauty. When the hour grew thin, desire threaded itself through the wire, delicate, insistent, aware of its trespass. Ethan felt it in the way he stalled before goodbye, in the way he began to measure his calendar, not in meetings, but in distances between her voice and the next time he might hear it. He was not embarrassed by it. He was careful with it, like someone carrying a candle through wind. Naomi felt it too. To pretend otherwise would be a smaller lie than she allowed herself. But the feeling arrived with its own stern chaperone. History. She had walked through rooms where women like her were turned into footnotes in a man's self-discovery, a flourish on his path to redemption. She had no intention of being an anecdote, however tender the telling. So she kept the conversation anchored to work until the tether felt secure enough to bear weight. And even then she tested it with small tugs. One night, when the city was all spine and whisper, Ethan said, "I keep wanting to ask you things that aren't on the agenda." "Ask them," she said, and then added, "knowing I reserve the right not to answer." Fair. A quiet. Then simply, "What frightens you most about this, knowing me?" She didn't let the question bloom into theater. "Becoming a chapter in a book I didn't agree to write," she said, "or worse, an illustration. I am not a moral to anyone's story." He took that in with a sound that might have been shame. "You aren't." "Intentions don't change outcomes," she replied. "Power does that." He did not retreat to argument. "Then show me where mine ends and yours begins," he said painstakingly. "Tell me when I step wrong. I can't change what I don't see, but I can refuse to pretend the room is evenly lit." She let the carefulness touch her. "I won't ask you to be smaller," she said. "I'll ask you to notice how much space you were taught to take, and to make room on purpose." "I can do that," he answered, and the way he said it was less promise than practice. The calls began to carry daylight across them, even when the hour was black. She would challenge a proposal. He would dismantle a defense he hadn't realized he'd built. He did not try to buy her agreement with access or awe. She did not punish him for a lineage he hadn't chosen. Between them grew a discipline not unlike desire. Attention. Once, near 2 a.m., he asked, "If I were not who I am, if my name were smaller, would this be easier?" "It would be different," she said. "Not easier. You'd have a different set of blind corners, and I'd have a different set of cautions. The question isn't how to erase what we are. It's whether we can meet without pretending. And can we? We're trying, she said. That is not nothing. The night after a brutal board meeting, he called later than late. She almost didn't pick up. When she did, the quiet on his end felt heavier than the hour. I don't know, he said, voice rough. How to be both necessary and good. You're not required to be either tonight, Naomi answered. You're required to be honest. Say the part you would not say in a room. He did. It was not pretty. It was human. She did not soothe him with absolutions. She steadied him with naming. What was fear? What was pride? What was grief wearing a better suit? When he thanked her, she said, I didn't fix anything. He said, you didn't make it about me winning. And somehow that felt like a kind of grace. The calls did not become nightly. They became inevitable. He craved them, not her approval, not even her agreement, but the sensation of being read without being reduced. She did not starve him of the warmth she felt. She rationed it with care, so it would not be mistaken for permission he had not earned. Once, when he ventured, "May I take you to dinner?" The pause on the line was brief and decisive. "Not as your guest," she said, "as my equal. Choose a place where we are both seen as ourselves." He did not ask what that meant. He learned. He named a quiet restaurant in Bronzeville where the owner greeted everyone by first name and the menu read like a family album. "There," he said, "if you agree." "Possibility," she said, that little lamp again. After they hung up, he stood for a long time in his kitchen, palms flat on the counter, as if steadiness were something one could press into the grain. Across town, Naomi rinsed her teacup and set it on its saucer like a punctuation mark placed with care. Desire remained, unashamed, refined by caution. Professionalism held, intact, widened by trust. Power didn't vanish. It learned to ask permission. Outside, the river moved in its patient dark, ferrying the city's reflections toward morning. In two separate rooms, a man and a woman found themselves awake at the same moment, listening to the soft static that sometimes precedes a voice, preparing to hear it as clearly as they dared. The elevator rose without hurry, a small room of brushed steel carrying them through the building's quiet throat. Naomi watched the numbers climb and felt the old discipline return. Breath in counts of 4, shoulders soft, jaw unlatched. Ethan stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, the same careful posture he'd learned in rooms that demanded a performance and in moments that asked for restraint. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Chicago did the talking. The low grind of evening traffic, the sigh of wind along stone, a saxophone from a nearby block practicing scales that ended in longing. The doors opened to a rooftop that felt impossibly private, as if the city had parted a curtain on purpose. Planters of rosemary and thyme lined the parapet. Their perfume threaded the air. A canopy of filament bulbs glowed like constellations reluctant to leave the earth. Tables were spaced as though distance too could be kind. Beyond, the skyline rose in a choir of glass and steel, each building singing its own weather. The host led them to a corner table where the railing made a gentle right angle, and the river's dark ribbon could just be seen. "Thank you for choosing this," Naomi said when they were alone, smoothing the napkin across her lap. "It feels like somewhere people remember how to talk to each other." "I wanted a view that didn't eclipse the table," Ethan answered, and she felt the intention land. They let the first minutes belong to the ritual of a meal. Water poured, bread broke. The evening decided on a temperature and kept it. Their conversation stayed with simple things: the herb on the roasted fish, the deep comfort of a lemon that was truly ripe, the way a city at night allows strangers the dignity of silhouettes. If there was a current pulling beneath, they didn't fight it. They kept their oars raised, let the water know they were listening. When the plates were cleared and a quiet fell into the space between them, Ethan took a breath that rearranged him. He did not straighten like a man preparing a pitch. He loosened, as if stepping out of armor. "I've been rehearsing this," he said, and the confession itself made his voice steadier. "Which is to say, I've been trying not to. The truth doesn't need choreography. It needs courage. I'm not used to spending." Naomi's fingers rested on the stem of her glass. She did not rescue him with speech. She offered him the soft regard that had made honesty possible in him the first time. He stopped, amended. I feel something for you that doesn't fit inside the structures I built to pass as a good life. It doesn't negotiate well. It doesn't check my calendar. It simply persists. I hear you in rooms you aren't in. I look for your name in hours that don't have names. And I am afraid of what wanting can make of me if I'm not careful. The filament bulbs hummed. Somewhere, a door opened and closed, the shared sound of other lives. Naomi's heart lifted with a movement she recognized as both gladness and warning. Afraid of what? She asked, though she knew. That I could make you a story about me, he said. That I could mistake your light for my reflection. That I could harm you with the very power I mean to set down. His candor struck a tuning fork in her. She had been prepared for charm and for certainty. Fear wore a different face. It was humbler. It made room. She felt her own caution rifle its papers, searching for a clause that would let her leave now, intact. It did not find one that felt like truth. I feel it too, Naomi said softly, and the honesty of it moved through her like relief and like risk. I don't know when it began. Possibly at the bridge, possibly at the moment you admitted you didn't cry, possibly at 2 a.m. when you let failure sit at the table and you didn't try to rename it. But it's there, persistent, as you said, and I am also afraid. What frightens you? His voice was almost a whisper, not from timidity, but from reverence for the answer. That the world will be too pleased with its own narrative, she said, that I will be asked to represent something I did not elect, that I will lose the portion of myself that refuses to be curated, and that even with all your care, I might end up smaller in the telling. He shook his head once, not in denial but in grief at the possibility. I don't want a version of you that fits me, he said. I want the you that takes up her own dimensions and makes me adjust. The waiter appeared with a pot of mint tea and left as quietly as he came. Steam twined upward, making small ghosts that vanished before they were named. Naomi wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth advocate for staying. You should know, she said, that I won't be a secret. You shouldn't be, he replied, but I also don't want you exposed to a curiosity you didn't consent to feed. That curiosity is not new, she said wryly. It's merely sharper with a lens. Then let me be the glass that moves between you and it, he offered. You can't be glass and equal, she countered gently. Pick. He smiled without defense. She saw his father's training step aside for his own choosing. Equal, he said, always. Silence grew again, but this time it was a shared room, not a hallway between them. He reached for his cup, paused, and set his hand flat on the table instead, palm up, as if to place a question where she could see it. She looked at the hand, at the strong veins that told a different story than the cufflinks, at the restraint that kept it still. May I? He asked, and though he did not say the rest, touch you, cross this, risk us, she heard it. Naomi placed her hand in his. Not to be taken, to be met. The contact was light, the way first snow accepts a field. Heat moved between their skin like a subtle vow. Nothing will be rushed, nothing assumed, nothing claimed that isn't offered. She felt, with a clarity that left no oxygen for pretense, how rarely she had been held this way, without agenda, without an audience, without a script. She lifted her eyes to his, and he did not look away. The city made its music below them. The river received another hour. The bulbs raised their soft stars. What happens now? He asked. We honor what we said, she replied. We don't pretend the dangers aren't real. We don't pretend the feelings aren't either. We keep our work honest, he added. And our desire, she returned. And when my name tries to crowd the room, I'll ask it to sit, she said. And you will too. He nodded, almost smiling. And when fear arrives, we make it tea, she said, glancing at the pot. We let it sit between us, not inside us. The wind shifted, carrying rosemary up to them like a blessing. From here, the buildings looked less like statues and more like instruments, tuned to a city that had learned to play both sorrow and joy in the same key. Naomi felt something in her, long disciplined and justifiably wary, stretched toward the light, like a plant that had been kept too long in shadow. Naomi, Ethan said, her name carefully, as if it were a delicate object that, if mishandled, could become a weapon. I don't know the right way to do this. I only know the wrong way is alone. She squeezed his hand once, brief and unmistakable. Then don't be alone, she said, and don't make me be. A siren braided the distance and unbraided. Two laughter bursts rose from the far side of the rooftop and dissolved. Their waiter reappeared with a small plate of sugared citrus peels the kitchen sent just because. They each took one and let the sweet sting rest on their tongues. "Will you walk with me?" Ethan asked when the check had discreetly changed hands. They traced the perimeter in unhurried steps, pausing at the railing to let the wind do its untying. He didn't reach for her again. He didn't need to. Something essential had already occurred at that table. A declaration that refused spectacle. A vulnerability that refused performance. When the elevator doors closed on their quiet, the city's lights found their reflections and held them. Two figures, not yet a pair, but no longer separate in the way they had been. At the street, he hailed a taxi for her and didn't try to climb in. He didn't ask to be invited upstairs. He did not invent a promise he could not yet keep. He rested his hand on the open door and said, "Tomorrow, I'm due at the foundation before dawn. There's a board member who still thinks graphs are gods." "Tell him I said curves are people," she replied. "I will," he said, and his smile found the surface without losing the depth. The car pulled away. Naomi watched the rooftop shrink in the rear window until it became a single square of warm light in a building that held hundreds. She did not look away until it vanished. When she turned forward, the night had not changed. She had. Somewhere, in the seam between fear and willingness, a decision had made itself, not to surrender caution, but to walk with it as an honest companion toward whatever this would ask of them. The first whisper did not sound like a rumor. It arrived as a question in a hallway where the carpet softened footsteps and the sconces made a theater of good behavior. "Did you see the email?" Someone asked, no one in particular, and three someones paused just long enough to be seen pausing. By afternoon, the question had acquired a subject, by evening an object, and by morning a name. Naomi. It moved the way such things move, beneath the songs the city sings about itself, beneath the official memos, through the silverware hum of catered lunches and the breathless hush of "just between us." It was a small thing, the whisper, but it knew the architecture of corridors and the patience of carpet. It threaded, it nested, it grew. The email in question surfaced in the sanitized light of a conference room, its subject line clean as a blade. APDF. A forwarded chain. Dates aligned with late nights she had indeed spent working. A handful of phrases she could imagine writing because they were analysis she believed in. A recipient address that belonged to a rival firm whose logo made the air colder by 2 degrees. The attachment was a spreadsheet with columns calibrated to look like all spreadsheets. Rational, innocent, cruel. "I didn't send this," Naomi said, and the truth of it stood up even as her throat tightened. Julian was the first to see her face and understand the shape of what had been done. "We'll check headers," he said, already reaching for the practical, for the comfort of verbs. Examine, verify, trace. Metadata doesn't lie. People do. Across the river, in the high-gloss world of the Caldwell Foundation, Margaret attended to orchids and optics with the same exacting patience. She did not send emails. She made sure they were found. She did not raise her voice. She adjusted lighting. She did not accuse. She asked if the board should be responsible stewards and diligent guardians of trust. She gave phrases the careful polish of duty until they shone like virtue and reflected precisely what she required. When the board subcommittee met to review concerns, Ethan entered late, wind under his coat, apology at his lips. A printout lay at each seat, the monospaced comfort of text arranged to look inevitable. He skimmed, then read, then reread. He kept his face still by a discipline learned in rooms where a father taught him that expressions could become weapons. "This isn't Naomi," he said too quickly, and the swiftness sounded to two of the men like bias, and to Margaret like proof that her son's heart had become a variable she could no longer predict. "My darling," she said, careful with endearments as one is careful with instruments. "No one is accusing. We are clarifying. The organization must protect itself." "And the people who protect it?" Ethan returned. "Who protects them?" "A fair question," Margaret allowed, palms open. rings glinting like small arguments. Which is why facts are our friends. Facts appeared where they were needed. A timestamp close enough to plausibility to be believed. A server log with the soft authority of code. A witness who remembered a glance at a screen and upgraded it, under pressure, to knowledge. No one said fabrication. No one would. But the table began to behave as though there were two truths, one tidy and printed, one warm and human. And the tidy one looked better under fluorescent lights. Naomi felt the temperature change before the emails reached her screen. She had spent a lifetime learning to read a room at the level of pores. She saw it in the way a receptionist's smile took a millisecond longer to arrive, in the extra chair left outside a conference room, just in case, in the well-meaning colleague who sent a text that was really a prayer. "You okay?" She answered as if strength could be typed. "I'm fine." She was not. Fine is a fiction we use to protect a day from becoming its own headline. That evening, Ethan called, voice already apologizing to something he could not name. "Tell me it isn't true," he said, and the words were not a doubt so much as a plea to be given the shape into which he could fit his certainty. "It isn't true," Naomi said. She did not add darling or believe me or how dare you. She gave only the truth and the dignity a truth expects. "Someone is building a story with my name on it." He shut his eyes at the kitchen counter, palm pressing the oak as if steadiness could be borrowed from wood. "I will fix it." "Don't promise that," she said, gentle as a warning. "Promise me you will see me." "I do," he answered, and meant it so fiercely that the fierceness frightened him. But seeing is not simple when rooms are full of mirrors. The next morning brought a new find. A draft in a cloud folder she did not use. Auto-saved in an hour she had been on the phone with him discussing nothing more subversive than procurement guidelines. "It's her work," a trustee noted, tapping a paragraph with the grim satisfaction of a man who thinks confirmation is truth's cousin. Her voice. Ethan read the paragraph and heard Naomi. In this fact, there were two possibilities, and he knew them both. Either she had written to persuade the rival, or someone had written like her to undo her. The former was efficient, the latter personal. He understood efficiency. He did not yet know the anatomy of malice. Margaret watched the uncertainty slide like a shadow across her son's face and felt the old instinct rise, the one she justified with terms like safeguarding and legacy. She remembered how quickly love had made him soft as a boy, how he had wept over a fallen fledgling, how he had built impossible nests from shoelaces and hope. She had taught him to outgrow softness. She now regretted she had not excised it. At lunch, she took him to a room designed to resemble privacy. "I admire her," Margaret said, and the sentence sounded like a benediction. "She is formidable, which is why we must be sure." "Of her?" Ethan asked. "Of the risk," she said, and let the pronoun do quiet violence. He left the table with a headache and a list of responsible next steps. Words like pause and review and independent verification, which in practice meant suspicion given chairs and microphones. When he dialed Naomi, his mouth was full of caution and his chest of ache. "I need to ask for patience," he began, hating the taste of each syllable. "There are processes." "Processes don't need me to forgive them," she interrupted, voice even. "You do," he swallowed. "I am not doubting you. You are doubting the world enough to ask it to doubt me," she said, and the distinction landed like a bell struck clean. He sat very still, the line taut between them. "Tell me how to proceed that doesn't turn you into a case." "See me," she said again, "and make the room do the same." He promised what he could. Meetings, auditors, a halt to any public statement. He went to war in the only arena offered. Memos, policies, the circling wagons of officially concerned people. He did not yet understand that the real battle had already moved to the hallways, where glances are verdicts and silence is a sentence served without appeal. Naomi, who understood, doubled her calm until it read as distance to those eager to misinterpret. She did not stop working. She sharpened. She documented. She slept less and dreamed more. In one dream the bridge returned, rain gentler, river patient. Ethan beside her not as a man who could fix a thing, but as a man who would not call a wound a lesson. She woke with salt on her cheek and no memory of crying. 2 nights into the storm, Julian arrived with pizza and proof that small kindnesses make a scaffolding around a person. Headers don't match, he said, laptop open, eyes bright with righteous fatigue. The path is clever, but not clean. Somebody laundered the origin through a ghost account. There's a fingerprint in the time zone. Whose? Naomi asked. Whoever wanted to be almost caught, he said. Margaret won't be attached to a keyboard. But someone who serves her certainty will have left a thread. Naomi thought of threads, how easily they can be pulled from a hem, how quickly a dress will come apart if a hand is persistent and uninterested in the wearer's warmth. She thanked him and felt the gratitude as both grace and grief. Not because she doubted the outcome, truth has its own stamina, but because she could feel trust paying a tax to time. Love, when asked to wait, must not be told that waiting is a virtue. It must be shown that waiting is shared. Ethan texted close to midnight. I'm in a room I don't respect, arguing for a person I love with people who prefer the peace of a doubt to the cost of a correction. Forgive the word love if it harms. It is the only accurate one I have. Her reply came slowly, not because of the word, but because of the weight. You do not harm me with accuracy, she wrote. You harm me when accuracy must compete with optics and loses. He read and bowed his head, the posture of a man whose prayer is not request, but recognition. From the doorway, Margaret watched him with a look a stranger might mistake for maternal worry. It was closer to strategy. She said nothing. Silence is an instrument when one has tuned a room to respond to it. Only the hinge of her jaw moved, the smallest weather front passing through an otherwise clear sky. By week's end, the rumor had become a power with furniture. It sat in meetings, it ordered expensive coffee, it waited in inboxes and sent calendar invites. Naomi's name arrived on her own screen as a subject line. She opened each message and answered with clarity that refused performance. Yet clarity does not glitter. Suspicion does. The world loves sparkle. On Friday, the river ran fast with the snowmelt of a sudden thaw. Naomi stood on the riverwalk, coat collar high, gloved hands bare anyway to feel the air's new edge. She did not cry. She let the wind do it for her. Footsteps approached. She didn't turn until he was near enough that his breath made a small cloud beside hers. Tell me what you need of me, Ethan said, and the sentence was stripped of heroics. It was naked and exact. She looked at him and felt the measurable distance between what he wanted to give and what the world would allow him to deliver without breaking something he had been told he must not break. I need you to be brave in public and tender in private, she said. I need you to know the difference between saving and standing with. I need you to remember that love is not an alibi and trust is not a press release. He nodded once, the nod of a man learning a posture that might redeem his height. I can do that, he said, and for the first time since the whisper learned her name, she believed him. They stood together, not touching, while the river shouldered on. Above them, in an office whose glass believed itself invisible, Margaret watched two silhouettes and revised a plan. Suspicion, well tended, could be cultivated like orchids. All it needed was a gardener who understood light. They chose a conference room that pretended to be neutral. White walls, a window like a glossy eye, a table so polished it reflected indecision. On the credenza, bottled water waited in rows, as if thirst could be planned for. Ethan arrived first and stood rather than sat, palms on the chair back, the posture of a man trying to steady furniture that was already steady. The city lay behind the glass, impersonal and ablaze. Naomi entered with a folder in her hands and nothing in her face that could be mistaken for apology. She closed the door with careful quiet and set the folder down. You asked for this, she said. Let's not pretend the room summoned us. He met her eyes and felt the floor tilt, the reliable vertigo of loving someone who refused to be a version. The board is insisting, he began, and the sentence felt like a betrayal of subject and verb. There are procedures, obligations. They want a formal statement from you. They want access to your devices. They've retained an outside firm. My devices are not the property of your doubt, she replied evenly. Nor is my name, Naomi. Say what you came to say. The two of them stood in opposing doorways of the same feeling, neither willing to cross with empty hands. Ethan inhaled until his ribs argued. I don't believe you did this, he said, and the rush to assert it came out too fast, too loud. like a man barricading a door after the intruder has already entered. But the evidence. The evidence was crafted, she said, not gathered. It is an arrangement, not a discovery. He looked past her shoulder for a second, to where the city kept pretending it didn't care. My mother. Yes, she said, and the softness with which she said the word hurt more than anger would have. Your mother. She says she's only protecting the foundation, he went on, as if reciting a creed he no longer believed, and that she admires you. She says we have to let the facts do their work. Facts, Naomi said, do not select their lighting. Silence stepped in, uninvited and inevitable. He wanted to reach for her. He kept his hands at his sides because reaching, just now, would confuse comfort with absolution. Will you give them the devices? He asked finally, hating the ask, hating the necessity his role pretended to impose. Let me run this through the official channel. Let me, let you play the part where you are both my defender and my judge? She tipped her head. No, it's not that, he said, and heard the weakness leak into the words. It's the only path that doesn't look like obstruction. I am not responsible for the optics of my innocence, she said, only for its truth. Something inside him flared, pride, fear, a lifetime of being taught that responsibility means making yourself palatable to processes. You're asking me to defy the board, he said quietly. I am asking you to remember who I am when the board forgets, she answered. He moved around the chair and sat, the gesture small and capitulating. The table threw his face back at him, thinner and older. I am trying, he said, and the plainness of it was almost boyish. But they have lawyers with binders and language that impersonates morality. They call it stewardship, and I hear control, and I... He stopped, as if his mouth had outrun his authority. Naomi opened the folder and slid a page forward. The beginnings of Julian's analysis. Headers and time zones. A breadcrumb that refused to be swept. There, she said, a path. You don't need my phone to follow it. You need courage. He took the page and read like a drowning man reading the tide chart. The evidence was not yet a net, it was a thread. But it ran in a direction that was not her. Relief arrived and collided with the shame of having needed paper to breathe. He set the page down like something fragile. Thank you, he said, and meant, thank you for not making me beg. Thank you for still speaking to me as if I am salvageable. I will take this to the committee. You will take this to your mother, she said, as fact. He flinched, almost invisibly. Yes, and she will say it is inconclusive. Yes, he admitted, and you will be asked to wait. He closed his eyes. Yes. She watched him sit inside a life that had taught him to mistake procedure for virtue, and realized, with the clarity of a blade in cold water, that love could not save him from that lesson. Only his own choosing could. Ethan, she said, and the name came out like a blessing with a warning folded into it. I cannot be with a man who needs a quorum to recognize me. He opened his eyes. The hurt there was not for himself. I do recognize you. Then why do I feel interrogated, she asked. Why have I spent a week answering questions designed to confirm a story someone else wrote? Because I let the room write it, he said, the confession ripping itself free. Because I was afraid that if I stood too fast, I would fall alone. You are not alone, she said, and the tenderness of it burned. But you are choosing the kind of company you keep. Something gave way, pride perhaps, or the thin plank that had tried to hold the weight of two loyalties. He rose, hands open, and took one careful step, stopping. She looked at those open hands and knew how sweet they had been, and how dangerous. I cannot be the place you hide from your public, she said. Then I'll come with you into the light, he said quickly, too quickly, as if the sentence could be an action. I'll say it. I'll say all of it. Say what? Her voice did not rise. That you love me? You wrote that in a text. He faltered. Not because love changes with the hour. Naomi drew in the line held between them like a wire in winter, singing with tension. He wanted to promise. She wanted to trust. Between want and will, something fragile tore. Give me time, he said, last resort of the earnest. Time is what rumors eat, she replied, and I am tired of feeding them. He closed his eyes again, because tears threatened, and he had disciplined himself against their public usefulness. When he opened them, she had already gathered the folder. The room seemed to tilt toward her, as if the door understood where the story must go. Naomi, he took one step more, and the chair's leg caught and scraped. The ugly sound embarrassed the air. She turned at the door, hand on the handle, and for a long second looked at him as one looks at a body of water one has loved, aware of its beauty and of its danger. "I told you on the roof," she said quietly. "I won't be a secret. Today I add, I won't be a lesson either." He reached out, only air between them, and let his arm fall. "I am sorry," he said, the phrase inadequate and nonetheless true. "I am more sorry than any sentence can hold." "I know," she said, and the mercy of it was the final wound. "That's not the same as safe." She opened the door and walked into the corridor's hush. The carpet accepted her, a conspirator to exits. The office went on performing its noon, printers murmuring, heels deciding their velocities, a laugh from the far side of a partition. Behind her, the polished table reflected a man sitting very still, learning the difference between loving a woman and deserving to stand beside her when the lights were bright. Naomi did not cry in the elevator, nor in the lobby where the doorman said, "Good afternoon," in the voice of a man who remembers names. She made it to the street and turned her face toward the river, and only there allowed the city to blur. The wind did not steal the wet from her lashes fast enough to protect her pride. She let it, because pride had done enough work for one day. She walked until the water was in view, and stood where the railing made a right angle, the same geometry that had once held a quiet rooftop table. Somewhere above, a window collected the full, merciless winter light and spilled it back. Behind glass on a higher floor, Margaret watched a small figure become a smaller one. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She noted that the necessary had begun to be done, and that her son, whose softness she'd never fully eradicated, would either harden or break. On the horizon, the city held its tongue. The river went on, carrying reflections toward a place where they could not be retrieved. Silence did not arrive like peace. It arrived like dust, settling on everything, soft to the eye, suffocating to the lungs. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, Naomi learned how many ways a phone could be quiet. The calls that once braided purpose through midnight went missing first. Then the emails that used to begin with her name and end in gratitude thinned to acknowledgments and, eventually, to nothing. Meetings slid off calendars with the clean efficiency of snow from a pitched roof. No one said blacklist. No one had to. The city knew how to change the temperature, 1 degree at a time, until breath became work. Her consulting firm kept her on the masthead, but new work curiously required different experience. Clients who had praised her precision now preferred a softer edge. Read, a different face. One sent flowers in a vase shaped like an apology. Another wrote a note that said, "Thank you for your integrity," and CC'd no one. Julian stayed, a stubborn orbit, arriving with soup and spreadsheets, and the patient fury of a friend who refuses to accept a world's verdict. "We'll trace it," he said, tapping headers, unraveling time zones. Truth is slow only when men stand in front of it. Naomi moved through days as though the city had been muffled. She walked to the river and back, counted the green lights that turned yellow too quickly, washed a single cup and set it carefully to dry. She forgot music on the first day and remembered it on the 9th, low and blue, Coltrane telling her that sorrow had a spine and could stand up without turning itself into theater. Nights stretched. Sleep came like a guest who refused to commit, arriving late, leaving early, never quite taking off its coat. It wasn't work alone that faltered. It was the steady faith she kept in the mirror. Not that she had done anything wrong, that knowledge remained clean, but that the world could make something wrong of her with such tidy confidence. And behind that, colder than rumor, lingered the shape of Ethan's face in the conference room. Love trying to live inside language built to contain liability. She had not expected a savior. She had expected, perhaps unfairly, that the man who had confessed fear would now be brave on purpose. The bruise of that miscalculation deepened, yellowed, then darkened, refusing to fade. Across the river, the Calder mobiles swung lazily in a lobby no one noticed unless they needed to remember culture. In the Caldwell Tower, the Foundation's minutes stacked neatly. The Empire, as newspapers like to call it, did what empires do. It expanded through strategy and appetite. Margaret's calendar filled itself. Her counsel, so often solicited, began to shape not only the response to scandal that wasn't, but the tone of every initiative. Donors loved resolve. Boards loved results. Margaret delivered both. She did not gloat. She did not need to. Influence, properly tended, makes its own weather. Ethan answered to that weather, even as he stood in its rain. He did not sleep, or when he did, it was the muscular sleep of a man outrunning himself. He worked in a way that looked like dedication and felt like penance, arriving first, leaving last, feeding the machine the hours it demanded, as if it might forgive him for feeding Naomi to doubt. His assistants learned the shape of his silence and began to interpret it as preference. The building took his reflection into its glass each morning and returned a version of him in the evening, sleeker, thinner, dimmer at the edges. He thought of her at strange times, halfway through a briefing when a phrase like optics management touched his ear like a slap. Passing a shop window where blue tiles mocked him into remembering the cafe he hadn't entered since the night everything bent. In elevators when doors closed and left him alone with a face he no longer believed had earned its height. He wrote texts and deleted them, drafted emails and sent none. Once, at 3 in the morning, he dialed and hung up on the second ring, hand to mouth. Shame a physical object he could not swallow. Margaret watched him without triumph. She saw the hollowness as both cost and investment, a necessary void into which responsibility could be poured. She told herself she was saving him from a softer ruin. She reminded him that the foundation's work required rigor, not romance. "You cannot be persuaded by feeling," she said gently at breakfast, spread marmalade with a precision that forgave nothing. He nodded, grateful for instructions, and left with a tie straight enough to pass inspection. In the elevator's mirrored steel, the man who stared back seemed well. Mirrors lie politely. Julian's investigation began to find traction in the places where arrogance leaves fingerprints. A login from a VPN that changed its socks but forgot its shoes. A draft that saved itself twice, once in a place it shouldn't exist, and once in a log that believed in entropy, less than its architect believed in immunity. Names began to coalesce, not around Margaret directly. She never touched the keyboard, but around an aide whose loyalty functioned like religion. It was almost enough to drag truth into daylight. Almost. Naomi listened as he laid out the path. She nodded. She praised his sleeplessness and sent him home. When he left, the apartment's quiet rose again, faithful as tide. She sat on the floor with her back against the couch and pressed her thumb into the seam of the rug until a small crescent of pain bloomed. She stayed there a long time. If the phone rang, she did not hear it. If it did not, that seemed right. One afternoon, she found herself outside the cafe with the blue tiles, surprised by her own feat. The barista had changed the playlist. No Coltrane today, just a piano politely refusing to decide between major and minor. She took a corner table and cupped a mug in both hands, like warmth itself were a choice she could make and keep. The door opened, closed. It happened 3 times before she realized she was counting his arrivals in absentia. She stopped. She drank. She left a tip larger than the bill and walked home by a route she did not usually take, as if new streets could detour memory. At the foundation, a gala photograph circulated. Ethan flanked by trustees, Margaret brilliant with certainty, captions congratulating a grant that would change a city block into a brochure. Papers called him visionary. A magazine called him heir and innovator in the same sentence, as if lineage were an achievement. He stared at the image and saw only the space where he was not standing, with her, in a room that required no performance. The empire grew. The man shrank to fit a frame that praised utility and punished doubt. Pride wore a suit and answered to his name. Power shook hands in his stead. Once, in a meeting that had nothing to do with the matter at hand, a board member said Naomi's name and let the room watch him for a reaction. He gave none, and in the giving of none, he felt himself become less. Later, in his office, he closed the door and turned off the lights and sat on the floor because chairs were too honest. He tried to pray and remembered he had unlearned how. He tried to breathe and remembered that air had become a moral decision. He tried to love her from a distance and found that distance had its own appetite. Naomi began to teach a class, unofficial, unpaid, at a community center where budgets did not flatter themselves. She spoke to women who wanted to start businesses that wouldn't be asked for their pedigree. She taught them to read contracts and to say no to the clauses that turned trust into trapdoors. When she left each evening, tired in a way that made sleep more possible, she felt most like herself. Useful, uncurated, answerable only to the work and the faces it fed. In the mirror, she looked older around the eyes and more exactly arranged inside. A letter arrived from the Foundation's legal team, measured and cordial, requesting again what had already been denied. Devices, access, cooperation. She placed it beneath a paperweight shaped like an orange. She did not tear it up. She did not answer it. Some arguments deserve only the dignity of being outlived. The city slid toward spring with the reluctance of a place that had learned to be suspicious of thaw. On a morning rinsed with rain, Ethan crossed the Michigan Avenue Bridge because his feet remembered before his mind permitted it. He stopped where a woman with an umbrella had once divided a storm so that he might stand in it and still be spared. The river moved as always, shouldering the reflections of buildings that insisted on their importance. He put his hands on the rail and pictured her doing the same somewhere else, committing to a future that did not require his repentance to begin. Margaret watched him from a car that did not belong to her but might as well have. She did not get out. She had learned that influence requires distance to retain its power. She looked at her son and thought, he is safe, he is small, he is salvageable. The combination satisfied the part of her that loved him, and the part that loved the edifice more. That night, Ethan returned to an apartment that had begun to look like a showplace again. Not because a stager had arranged it, but because he no longer disturbed it. He stood in the kitchen with the old mug he'd once favored on their calls, and found he couldn't hold it without hearing her voice. He set it down gently and left the room, as if leaving would spare the cup. In the bedroom, the city's light drew a ruler straight line across the ceiling. He lay beneath it and understood, with a clarity he could neither celebrate nor escape, that success had become a room with no windows, and that he had, brick by brick, followed the blueprint until air itself was optional. In another part of the city, Naomi opened her window to let the night in. It smelled of damp stone and something green rehearsing its lines. She leaned on the sill and did not narrate it to herself. She simply let it be night. Pride had exacted its cost. Power had too. What remained was a woman who had refused to become a cautionary tale, and a man learning, in the hard privacy of his own chest, that empire is a poor synonym for a life. The email arrived in a quiet hour, when the city's lights had loosened their grip and even elevators seemed to move more softly. Julian had fallen asleep at his desk, a spreadsheet gritted against his cheek like a reluctant tattoo, when the chime from his laptop stitched him back into wakefulness. The subject line read, "You're looking in the wrong night, no sender name," an address that meant nothing, as if syllables had been pulled from a hat. He hovered. Curiosity has broken wiser men. Care has saved poorer ones. He opened a sandbox, pulled the message into it, dissected headers the way a watchmaker opens a pocket watch. Patient, precise, unwilling to sacrifice beauty for haste. Inside waited a small archive, signed with a key he didn't recognize, and yet which carried the seriousness of a person who understood consequence. Log fragments, screen recordings, a comparison of hashes with timestamps annotated in a hand that had the austere elegance of someone who annotated for a court, not a friend. At the bottom, a single line. The ghost account isn't a ghost. Look for the recovery phone. Julian began to pull the thread. The recording showed a remote session opening in the Foundation's network through a dizzying periscope of VPNs. Shadows wearing shadows, until anonymity looked like arrogance. But arrogance leaves fingerprints because it believes it deserves to. One redirect passed through a misconfigured node that kissed the open web for a stuttered second. In that fraction, an IP announced itself like a bird call. He traced it to a residential fiber plan paid through a trust with a name too bland to be real. He called Naomi. "I have something," he said, and the restraint in his voice told her he had too much. "I'm listening." "Not over the phone," he said. "Come." She arrived with her coat open to the wind, eyes carrying the kind of wakefulness pain insists upon. Julian showed his work. The breadcrumb road, the mismatch between the cloud's time zone and the laptop's local clock. The save events that occurred when her own machine had been shut and sleeping. And finally, the recovery phone number linked to the ghost account. The last 4 digits matched a number on a donor contact sheet Naomi had once filed in a different life. 0047. A forgettable ending to a phone that had always answered before the second ring. "Whose?" she asked, though the quiet under her voice already knew. "Margaret Caldwell's private line," Julian said. "Not the foundation switchboard, the one her assistant guards like sacrament." He brought up a second document, an internal scheduling note from a personal assistant, Clara Voss, cross-referenced with security badge pings on the night the Naomi drafts had magically saved themselves. The ping placed Clara in a glassed-in office at 10:16 p.m., then in the server room at 10:31, with a maintenance contractor who would later appear as a line item on a third-party invoice, paid from a discretionary budget Margaret controlled. "The dates align with the forged emails," Julian said. "The device ID that initiated the remote session has been present on the Caldwell residence network, more than once." Naomi didn't speak. The room seemed to exhale for her. She had prepared herself for a culprit who would be difficult to catch and easy to blame. She had prepared herself less for a culprit dressed as family, the blade wrapped in the silk of legacy. "Does Ethan know?" she managed. "Not yet," Julian said. "I wanted you to see it first." They printed nothing. They carried the files like the fragility they were, not because the bits would break, but because the knowledge might. Naomi stood at the window, city fretted with rain, and lowered her forehead to the cool glass. Relief moved through her like a swift current, immediate and terrible. It did not bring comfort. It brought air, and with the air, the ache of a body re-remembering breath. "Truth is not kindness," she said softly. "It's accuracy. And accuracy hurts." Julian set a hand on the back of her chair and left it there, weightless but present. "We take it to him," he said, "and to the board, carefully. Not as spectacle, as correction." She nodded. "Not for my vindication," she added, surprising herself by finding the phrase ready. "For the record. For the women who come after me and refuse to learn the choreography of surviving a lie." They met Ethan in a borrowed conference room on a Sunday afternoon, when offices pretend to be churches, vacant, echoing, sanctified by absence. He arrived out of breath from a run he hadn't planned, sweat darkening the collar of a sweatshirt that made him look younger and more tired. He saw Naomi and stopped, as if a threshold had risen in front of him. "Thank you for coming," she said, formal because rage would have been easier. "I would have come anywhere you asked," he said, and meant it in the old way, the way that had broken. Julian didn't offer preliminaries. He opened the laptop and walked Ethan through the map, step by step, a teacher unspooling a theorem, until the only conclusion left was the one the geometry demanded. The recovery phone, the assistant's badge, the trust's payment to a contractor who had laid network cable in the foundation's server room and somehow billed an hour to the Caldwell residence. Names, dates, the indifference of numbers to reputation. Ethan listened without interruption. As the pattern resolved, his face emptied of the expressions he used to make other people comfortable. He looked, for once, unobserved even in company. When it ended, he didn't sit. He didn't pace. He put both hands flat on the table and bowed his head. "My mother," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sentence a man says when the floor he stands on and the roof he lives under are revealed to be the same thing. Shelter and trap. "Her line," Julian said carefully. "Her authority. Her intention is yours to name." Naomi's eyes didn't leave Ethan's hands. She remembered them on the rooftop, open and careful. She remembered them in the conference room, open and helpless. Now they were still, as if stillness could be punishment and prayer in equal measure. "I am going to be sick," he said, and crossed to the wastebasket. Not dramatically, but with the plainness of a person whose body refuses metaphors. He returned, rinsed his mouth, and stood with his palms braced on the sill, city pressing itself against the glass. "I will take this to the board," he said at last, voice scraped raw. "I will publish a retraction. I will apologize, publicly, and in every room that echoed the lie. I will." "No," Naomi said, too quickly for softness. He looked at her. She held the gaze. "You will do those things because they are required by justice, not love. Do not offer me the currency of your remorse. Pay the debt to the truth." He flinched. The correction fit and hurt. "You are right," he said, and the words shook. "Then be right out loud," she said, "with your name attached." With hers, he closed his eyes. The cost bloomed behind his lids like a negative. Money, donors, articles, a mother whose love had always arrived, taped to a contract. He had learned to call that contract protection. He now had new language. He opened his eyes and found Naomi still there, contained, unyielding, beautiful in the way a mountain is beautiful. Not because it comforts, but because it refuses to move to flatter a traveler. "I don't know how to forgive her," he murmured, and in that moment he was someone's son in a kitchen, not a man who owned a view. "You don't have to," Naomi said. "You have to name what she did." Julian gathered the files into an orderly stack, as if order could be a kindness. "I'll package this for counsel," he said. "Chain of custody intact. If anyone tries to call this rumor, they'll have to argue with the server logs." Ethan nodded without seeing him. His gaze stayed on Naomi, and there was love in it, undiminished, unuseful. "I don't ask you for anything," he said, "but I want to say." She raised a hand, not to silence him, but to bless the silence they would need. "When the statement is public," she said, "send me a link." Not before. It was more generous than he deserved. It was also a boundary that kept her whole. He accepted both by not arguing. They left the building at different paces, Julian brisk with purpose. Naomi measured as if each step were a line in a poem that needed to be read aloud. Ethan slow as contrition. Outside, the day had the glare of winter, pretending towards spring. The wind slapped and steadied in alternating turns, like a teacher who still believes in a student. That evening, Naomi sat at her window with the lamp off, letting the city write light on her walls. She thought of the strange mercy of proof and the stranger wound it had opened. There is a relief that resembles grief. It requires its own ritual. She brewed tea and didn't drink it. She lay on the rug and watched the shadows change shape with passing cars. She did not text him. When the phone vibrated at last, it was Julian. "Draft done. Council notified. It will be messy. It will be honest." Across town, Ethan stood in his mother's living room, a place curated to look inevitable. Collections that had learned to pass as taste, photographs that argued lineage. Margaret listened without interrupting, hands folded, eyes bright in the way glass is bright. When he finished, she said, "You are overreacting." And then, after he laid the logs in front of her, "This is politics, Ethan, not sin." He realized with a clarity that nearly knocked him back a step that they did not worship the same God. Truth had entered the house like a draft under a door. Once inside, it ran its hand along the walls, found the loose places, and pressed. What crumbled was not only a story but a structure. The empire would not fall tonight. Empires are slower than people to learn the cost of themselves. But a crack had announced itself, clean and resonant, and in the echo, a man stood hearing who he had been and who he might yet refuse to be. The Caldwell townhouse wore evening like a pedigree, lamplight falling in deliberate ovals, books arranged with the modesty of objects that know they are expensive. The piano in the front room was closed, a mouth that would not sing. Ethan paused at the threshold long enough to feel the old reflex reach for him, the need to make himself smaller, to fit a space that had been measured without him. Margaret rose from a settee upholstered in a silk that had learned to behave. She looked precisely as she intended, composed, luminous, untouchable. "Darling," she said, and the word did what it had always done, wrapped control in the gift paper of affection. "Mother," he answered, and set the folder on the table between them. Not flowers, not wine, not surrender. Evidence. She glanced at it as one glances at a menu already memorized. "You look tired," she observed. "Come, eat something." He did not sit. No. The refusal startled her no more than a curtain shifting would startle a storm. Still, one eyebrow lifted, the smallest economy of disapproval. Then tell me what brings you here at this hour, if not an appetite. I have logs, Ethan said, and his voice surprised them both. It was not loud. It was deft, like a key turning. A recovery number, badges and timestamps. A contractor paid from a discretionary account you control. Ethan. The name became an instrument tuned to patience. You have been misled. By who? He asked quietly. Not by Naomi, not by the facts, by you. Silence laid itself down between them with the soft confidence of a well-bred cat. Margaret touched the clasp of her necklace as if considering the weight of ornament. When she spoke, it was with the calm of a surgeon explaining a necessity. I asked Clara to manage a situation. She did so with more zeal than judgment, but the intention was clear. To protect you, to protect what you were born to build. He stared as if the sentence had been spoken in a dialect of love he no longer understood. From whom did you protect me? From a woman, Margaret said, the word neither insult nor compliment, only a category, who could ruin everything. Everything, he repeated, tasting it. My name, your work, the foundation's donors, or the scaffolding you've built around the idea that love must be administered like anesthesia. Her jaw tightened a fraction. The silk on the furniture seemed to draw a discreet breath. Don't be theatrical. I'm being accurate, he said, and set a page in front of her with the reverence one reserves for an indictment. You forged evidence. You authored a lie and pressed it into a room where my belief in you would carry it like gospel. I authorized a correction, Margaret countered, a course adjustment. Ethan, you know how these things work. Optics, narratives. You were drowning in sentiment. I removed the weight. He saw it then, as if someone had drawn the lines over a map he had always misread. The gentle violence of her care, the contracts hidden in comfort, the way every I love you had arrived braided to, I will decide. The boy in him, the one who had built nests from shoelaces, stood up and left. The man remained. You harmed her, he said. You tried to erase her. Margaret's eyes cooled in the precise way glass cools when air touches it. She is resilient, she said. If she is the woman you believe, she will recover. You, however, might not have. Attachments like that, public, inconvenient, racialized. He flinched before the word was finished, a reflex he resented on sight. Stop, she did not. The world is not as forgiving as your idealism. I will not apologize for seeing past your infatuation to the mountain you were born to climb. Look at you. The board listens when you enter a room. Cities pivot when you endorse a plan. Do you think that happens because you cry on bridges with strangers? He did not reach for rage. He reached for clarity, which proves sharper. It happens because you taught me to make myself useful to power. I am done mistaking that for good. You are sentimental tonight. I'm awake, he said. She sat back, regarding him as she might regard a painting she could not decide to buy. So what will you do, awake as you are? Tell the truth, he said simply, to the board, to the press, to anyone who listened when I stayed quiet while you arranged the weather. I will name what you did. I will attach my name to the naming. You will wreck us, Margaret said, and the restraint frayed. Do you comprehend what you're threatening? Years of labor, relationships built over decades, the work your father died perfecting. Ethan felt the familiar ache at the word father, the way it could sanctify a demand. He welcomed the ache and then refused its instruction. Father taught me to win, he said. You taught me to polish the winning until it looked like virtue. Neither of you taught me how to be decent. She did. The she did not require a name. Naomi stepped into the room like a weather system, unseen and absolute. Margaret stood. I will not be slandered in my own home. Then don't do slanderous things, he replied, and the sentence, almost playful, arrived in him like mercy, proof that tenderness could survive even here. Something old broke. She heard it too, because her face changed, not with shame, but with calculation, wounded by surprise. You would choose her over me. I would choose right over wrong, he said. And if you insist on standing on the wrong side, I will stand without you. She laughed then, A dry, bright sound that made the chandelier tremble. You won't survive this, Ethan. The board will devour you. Donors will desert you. You will be a prince without a kingdom and a man without a mother. And yet, he said, I will be a man. The room absorbed the line. Somewhere in the house, a clock remembered to chime. Margaret moved to the bar cart and poured water with theatrical restraint. You are ungrateful. I am unhypnotized, he returned. There's a difference. They looked at each other, two architects cataloging the cracks in a facade they had both, in different ways, learned to call home. At last she set down the glass, lifted her chin, and revealed the softer blade. I did it to protect you. Protection that requires a wound is not protection, he said. It's possession. Her mouth opened, closed. She had not expected rhetoric from him. She had expected the old boy, hands full of shoelaces. He stepped toward the door, took the folder, and left her only a copy, the courtesy of due process. Ethan, she said, his name a command that once would have stopped him mid-breath. He turned, hand on the knob. You will regret this. He searched her face for the woman who had taught him to tie his shoes, to hold a fork, to conceal a sob until it could be traded for an achievement. He loved that woman. He would always. He grieved her even as she stood in front of him alive. I regret that you made it necessary, he said, and went. Outside, the air felt like a first draft. He stood on the steps and exhaled a lifetime. The night did not applaud. It made room. He called counsel. He called the board chair. He called the publicist he trusted least and told her to sharpen mercy into a statement that did not flatter anyone. Then he walked, no destination, just streets that had watched him become and now agreed to watch him unbecome. Somewhere over the river, a train crossed and laid a ribbon of noise across the dark. He felt made of bruise and bell, loss and relief in equal parts. Behind him, in the curated quiet, Margaret sat very straight on the silk that had learned to behave and stared at the door as if she could reverse an exit by memorizing it. In her chest, something old and iron began at last to admit rust. She reached for the phone and then did not. Control is a habit. Abstaining from it is not. Ethan walked until the city loosened its jaw. He felt the boy he had been, step beside the man he was becoming. They did not speak. They did not need to. Somewhere in the future a bridge waited, and beneath it, a river that did not care about names. He would go there. He would say what was true. He would live with what it cost. It was raining again, the soft, tireless kind that makes the city feel as though it's speaking under its breath. Naomi heard it first in the radiator's sibilant complaint, then against the window, then at the door when a knock arrived wrapped in weather. She stood very still in the small square of light from the kitchen and did not move until the second knock, gentler, as if the person outside remembered she preferred questions to demands. When she opened the door, the hallway inhaled. Ethan stood there with his umbrella closed and dripping like a tired wing. His hair was wet at the temples. Water had darkened the shoulders of a jacket chosen without thinking. He looked like a man who had run out of performances on the way over and misplaced his defenses in the rain. May I come in? He asked, and the humility was unadorned, not theatrical. He did not step across the threshold. He waited. She moved aside. He entered the way one enters a chapel not dedicated to him, quietly, with his hands visible. The apartment smelled of lemon peel and books. On the table a mug cooled, a thin crescent of steam giving up its argument. He closed the umbrella, set it on the mat, and stayed near the door as if the distance could keep his presence from becoming a claim. I won't stay, he said. I only need to tell you the truth with my own mouth. Naomi nodded once. The rain threaded the silence between words. All right, he began, not at the beginning but at the ache. My mother did it, he said, voice steady until it wasn't. The accounts, the contractor, the recovery number, hers. The assistant helped. I have the logs. Council has them. The board has been notified. Tomorrow morning there will be a statement with my name at the bottom and hers in the middle, where it belongs. He swallowed. The words were exact and unsparing. Still, they seemed to cost him small pieces of breath. I should have seen it sooner, he went on. I should have believed you without evidence because I knew you. I knew you, and yet I asked the world to make space for doubt so I wouldn't have to spend courage I had apparently kept in storage. He lifted his eyes then, wet and unproud. I am sorry, Naomi. Not in the currency of spectacle, in the small, unmarketable coin of ordinary sorrow. I am sorry that I let a room tell me who you were when you had already told me yourself. She did not move. She had imagined this moment on nights when imagination was the only antidote against the room's verdict. She had pictured him contrite, eloquent, undone. She had not pictured how quiet it would feel in her chest. No triumph, no clean relief. Only a loosening in one place and a tightening in another. Sit, she said at last, and he did, on the edge of the small sofa where she read and did not fall asleep. She remained standing, then changed her mind and sat across from him in the chair that had learned her posture. What will happen to her? She asked. The board will remove her, he said. There will be an investigation. Perhaps more. I won't speak for prosecutors or donors or gods. I will speak what I know. I will name what she did. And you? I've resigned from the foundation, he said, and the sentence seemed to surprise him with its own finality, even though he had clearly practiced it alone. I'll stay to answer questions while the truth moves from rooms to paper. After that, he shook his head once. After that, I don't know. Maybe I'll finally learn the difference between building an organization and building a life. Rain moved down the window in patient integers. Naomi folded her hands, then unfolded them. Thank you for telling the truth, she said, for taking it into the daylight yourself. He breathed as though her sentence had made oxygen available again. It is yours, he said, and it is also mine to carry. A beat, then another. He was not pleading. The absence of pleading made the room kinder. Even so, the past week had left a seam in her she could not pretend away. I don't forgive you, she said, and watched the words land. They did not knock him back. They did not humiliate him. They did the quieter thing, made him still. I know, he answered. You shouldn't. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I don't know about ever, Naomi said. I only know about now, and now is this. My trust isn't a switch, it's a house. You evacuated it for a fire drill that turned out to be arson. I can't invite you back because you're sorry the alarm was loud. I need to rebuild the wiring. His mouth shaped what might have been a smile if it had more strength to draw from. Tell me how to help without moving in. You already are, she said, by doing publicly what should be public. By not using apology as a shortcut. He bowed his head. The old mug on her table sent up one last, ghostly thread of steam and gave up. May I ask you something? You may ask. When the statement is out, when the board is done making their version square, would you meet me at the bridge? His voice did not dress the ask in fate. Not to reset, to witness. The first time, you shared an umbrella with a stranger. I'd like to bring one to the woman who taught me how to stand in weather without lying about it. Naomi looked at his hands, folded, empty, learning how not to reach. She wanted to say yes because the image was gentle and because the rain made memory generous. She wanted to say no because generosity had nearly cost her herself. She did neither. If I come, she said, it will be because the work is done, not because the feeling asks for an intermission. Understood, he said, and meant it. They sat. The apartment's smallness, which on most nights was a comfort, now felt like the right size for a difficult thing. She rose, poured hot water over fresh leaves, set a cup in front of him without performance. He did not touch it. He watched the steam as if the air could narrate a better man into being. Naomi, he said softly, I loved you when I doubted, which is to say, I loved you poorly. I intend to love you in a way that does not require you to pay the tax on my education, if I get the chance. If I don't, I intend it anyway. She took her own cup between both palms. Intention is the beginning, she said, not the end. I know. She stood and moved to the window. The street lamp haloed every drop until rain looked like a million small lanterns falling. Behind her, he rose but didn't approach. She could feel his restraint like warmth arrested by glass. Present, considerate, insufficient. I'll go, he said at last. You've given me more time than I deserve inside your quiet. He lifted the umbrella, shook it once over the mat, and opened the door a fraction, letting the corridor's cool draft find the room. Ethan, He looked back. "Do not mistake my listening for absolution," she said, "but don't mistake my refusal to absolve for the end of listening." He took that as the gift it was. "I won't." The hallway accepted him and closed. She stood for a while with her hand on the door, palm flat to wood, as if feeling for a pulse on the other side. The rain went on, tireless, and the city returned to its murmur. She carried the cups to the sink and left them there, unwashed. A small proof that a conversation had occurred and that its afterlife would require tending. At the window, she watched the street rinse itself. Somewhere out there, a man with an umbrella was walking toward a reckoning he had chosen rather than inherited. In here, a woman with a dry floor and a tired light chose a chair, chose breath, chose the discipline of not narrating a future too soon. Trust, she knew, is rebuilt the way the body heals, slowly, with rest and blood and refusal to pick at the forming seam. Outside, the rain remembered the night they met and did what weather does best. It kept falling, without verdict, on everything. Spring arrived in the careful way it does in cities, tentative at first, then suddenly everywhere, like a secret no one could keep. Naomi felt it on her morning walks, the soft insistence of green along iron fences, the way windows forgot to be stern and let light reach the floor. In her apartment, a vase of tulips unfolded at its own unhurried pace. She pretended not to count the days since Ethan's visit, and the pretending required more effort than she liked to admit. Work grew again, not through grand contracts, but through smaller pieces that fit hand to hand. 2 neighborhood associations, a women's co-op that wanted to write bylaws as if dignity were a clause, a startup whose founder knew her name before her resume. The community center class doubled. Her Tuesday evening table filled with women who passed pens to one another and said, "You've got this," with the sweetness of a recipe learned from a grandmother. Independence hardened into shape not by defiance but by practice. She slept better. She smiled at strangers. She stopped checking her phone at red lights. And yet, there are silences one chooses and silences that choose you. When the day thinned, when the band in the corner of the blue-tiled cafe slid into something tender and complicated, when rain rehearsed against the window with 2 hands instead of 1, then the hesitation made itself known. Not as a rupture, as a question that continued to ask itself. Julian saw it. He had the loyalty required to keep his observations to himself, and the friendship required to spend them anyway. One night after class, he walked her home, their conversation skipping the way voices do when the body is tired enough to be honest. "Tell me you're sleeping," he said. "Most nights. Eating. Enough to convince my mother, if she were here." He nodded, then tried, clumsily, for lightness. "Any ascents up unwise mountains lately?" "Only the metaphorical kind," she said. "Those are steeper." They reached her stoop and paused under the awning. The rain had begun again, small and precise, not a storm so much as a reminder. "When he called," Julian said carefully, "to tell me he'd resigned, I believed him." "I did too," she said. "That doesn't obligate you." She looked at him, at the friend who had untangled code with the patience of a saint and the suspicion of a scientist, at the man who had brought soup and silence at equal intervals. "I know," he leaned a shoulder into the brick. "You want my counsel? Always. Love without trust is a cage," he said, the words slow, as if they'd cut his tongue on the way out. "And rebuilding trust isn't the same as issuing parole." She breathed. "You think I should walk away? I think you should choose a life that doesn't require you to shrink to fit someone else's apology," he said. Then gentler, "I also think longing is a fact, not a flaw." She smiled without showing teeth. "You're very wise tonight." "I'm tired," he countered. "It passes for wisdom." Inside, later, Naomi stood at the window and watched the city perform rain. Cars slowed, lights softened, pedestrians became shadows carrying small moons. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and let her reflection come close enough to merge. The question came back. Who am I in the life I choose? The answer refused to be summarized. Ethan's statement had gone public and stayed public. It was not ornate. It did not ask to be applauded. He named what his mother had done. He accepted responsibility without percussion. He resigned. He returned grant money that had been pledged under the period of falsehood. He ended with a line that read less like contrition than an attempt to learn a grammar. When power harms, repair is not the opposite of consequence. It is its companion. The city had opinions. The board had another. Margaret moved from rooms to rooms and refused questions she had once choreographed. Newspapers wrote columns that argued for ethics or against naivete. Social media did what social media does: burn and forget and burn again. Naomi read the statement once. She did not watch the interviews. She put her phone face down and watered the tulips. Forgiveness, she knew, is not a headline. It is a practice. And right now she had no practice in it that didn't also practice self-erasure. A week passed, then two. The tulips bowed out. A new vase held branches that promised white flowers if she waited them into being. She did not count that either. On a Saturday morning, the cafe remembered Coltrane. She claimed the corner stool and opened a stack of proposals. A family slid into the booth behind her. The father told his daughter a terrible joke, and the little girl laughed as if he had invented delight. Naomi felt a soft ache travel the length of her ribs. She owned her life. She liked it. But liking and longing are not mutually exclusive, and she was tired of pretending they were. She left early and walked to the river. The water was high, impatient from last night's storm. She stood at the rail and let the wind push a few tears out, efficient as a physician drawing blood. When the wave of feeling receded, a small clarity remained, not triumphant, simply exact. She didn't want to choose between a person and herself. She wanted to choose a version of herself that could stand beside a person without losing her outline. That afternoon, an email arrived from a national foundation inviting her to speak on ethics and equity in organizational repair. She stared at the subject line long enough to outlast the old fear that she was a symbol in somebody else's story. Then she said yes, but wrote the condition in her reply. I'll speak if I can refuse the panel question that asks me to turn my pain into a how-to list. The coordinator answered within the hour. Agreed. Independence has a sound. It is the click of a boundary locking. Evening fell. She lit a candle, then another. The room looked like an idea of home she trusted. Her phone breathed once on the table. No ringtone, just the soft thrum of a message arriving. She did not move until she finished the paragraph she was reading. Then she turned it over. Bridge, tomorrow. Rain likely. I'll bring the umbrella. No name, none needed. She let the words sit until they stopped glowing. Then she typed, erased, typed again, and sent. If I come, it's to talk about now, not to exhume then. The reply arrived almost immediately. Now is all I have that isn't shaped like regret. Sleep came late. She dreamed of thresholds, doorways without doors, fields with fences low enough to step over without tearing a dress. In the morning, the sky obliged the forecast. She dressed in navy and wore shoes that told the ground she would not be rushed into grace. On her way out, she glanced at the vase. The branches had opened, small white stars stating their case. She smiled at their audacity. At the bridge, the rain remembered to be beautiful. Ethan stood halfway across, no coat, hair damp, the old umbrella hooked over one wrist like a question mark made visible. He did not move toward her when he saw her coming. He waited with the posture of someone who accepts the terms of the meeting. Thank you for coming, he said, the phrase stripped of any triumph. Thank you for choosing to lose what you could not keep without losing yourself, she answered. They stood with a polite span of air between them, the kind space inhabits when it is being treated with respect. He opened the umbrella and held it out. She didn't take it. He tilted it so that half covered her shoulder and half left his uncovered as before. They smiled, both remembering, both refusing to let memory do more work than it had earned. I don't want to talk about the past, she said. I do, he admitted, only long enough to stop it from writing the future without permission. She breathed once, then nodded to the rail. They moved to it like old friends who had learned to share views without explaining them. The river wore the city's lights and refused to be impressed. I am building a life that does not orbit you, Naomi said. I like it. It is not a pose. Good, he said. I am trying to build a man who does not orbit an empire. It is not graceful. Graceful is overrated, she said. They were quiet a while. The rain stitched a fine curtain between them and the world. Somewhere a siren grew and shrank, a ribbon thrown and retrieved. "You asked me once what I'm like when I'm not required to be admired," he said. "I am trying to find out. I am clumsy. I am less impressive than my biography. I am more patient than my resume. I am here because I want a life that can be spoken in rooms that don't have microphones." She allowed the sincerity to touch her without laying claim. "I don't promise futures," she said. "I don't even promise next week. I promise attention. I promise not to confuse desire for destiny." "Then I will match you," he said. "Attention, no destiny, just what we can hold without breaking." She turned to look at him, and the boy and the man arranged themselves into a face she knew and didn't. He wasn't asking for absolution. He was asking for a chance to be observed while he did his own work. She could say no. Saying no would be clean, and cleanliness has glamour. But her heart was not a courtroom. It was a house with more than one room. Independence occupied the kitchen, efficient and warm. Longing stood at the window, unashamed to look. "I will walk with you," she said at last carefully. "Not behind you, not ahead. If you falter, I won't carry you. If I falter, I won't ask to be carried. We'll stop. We'll rest. We'll decide again." He exhaled, and the breath carried weather out of him. Yes, they didn't touch. The choice did not require contact to be real. They stood until the rain grew tired, and the river accepted one more hour. When she left, she did not look back to make a scene of departure. He didn't follow to make a scene of pursuit. The decision hovered between them, light and strong as a bridge built by hand. A span over a water that would keep moving no matter what they chose. A way across that honored both shores. The morning he stood before cameras, Ethan dressed like a man going to court with himself. No gleam in the tie, no hunger in the suit, just dark cloth that did not ask for praise. The lectern was ordinary wood, the backdrop a wall of unambitious gray. Reporters rustled like a mild storm. Somewhere behind the lights, the city waited for a performance. He gave them a confession. "My name opened doors," he began, voice steady as if each syllable had been weighed on a kitchen scale. "When a lie implicated a woman I loved and a colleague I respected, I allowed those doors to swing closed on her. That is on me. The actions that seeded the lie were authorized by my mother and executed by people in our orbit. That is on us. There will be consequences. I am resigning as CEO, effective immediately. I will stay only long enough to answer questions and ensure that the truth, not optics, not inheritance, governs what comes next." He paused. No theatrics. The room leaned in because restraint made space for listening. "Repair," he said, "is not a strategy. It is work. I will do it without asking to be applauded for choosing what was required." Questions followed, sharp and reasonable. He answered them like a craftsman setting joints, patient, precise, refusing shortcuts. He did not invoke his father. He did not explain his mother. He did not sell redemption as a product line. When it ended, he stepped away from the microphones and did not look back to see if the lenses loved him more for the humility. Lenses love anything briefly. The board met without him. Statements arrived with their careful verbs: remove, censure, cooperate. Margaret's name appeared beside nouns she had once controlled: investigation, oversight, transition, as if grammar itself had chosen to shift allegiance. In a photograph taken 2 days later, she stood on the townhouse steps, posture unbroken, eyes unreadable. She did not speak. A window at her shoulder framed a sliver of piano, lit up at last, an accidental honesty. Ethan turned in his badge and his parking pass and walked out of a lobby designed to feel inevitable. Outside, March had forgotten itself and come cold. He put his hands in his pockets and went nowhere glamorous. First to the apartment where the plants had soldiered through his neglect, then to a repair shop that still believed in parts and patience. He carried in a broken radio from his closet, a heavy, obstinate thing, and asked if he might sit and learn. The owner, a man with grease in the lines of his hands and a modest pride in his eyebrows, shrugged him into the back and gave him a stool. Don't force what resists, he advised. Coax it. Ethan coaxed. Coaxing turned out to be a language he had studied as a boy without knowing it counted. The days began to pattern themselves around small proofs. A dial cleaned, a capacitor replaced, the moment when static admitted it had been music all along. He slept like a person who had done a thing fully with his hands. Twice a week, he walked to a community kitchen and washed trays until his reflection blurred into steel. He learned the names of the women who ran the place and the jokes of the man who drove the delivery van. He listened to stories without annotating them with solutions. Sometimes on his way home, he passed the blue-tiled cafe and kept going. Sometimes he went in, ordered tea, and sat by the window where 2 winters ago, a stranger's grace had divided the weather. Naomi watched from the distance the city affords. A headline here, a rumor there, a sighting in a doorway full of steam. She did not stalk redemption. She observed it the way one observes a seedling after late frost, skeptical, tender, willing to be surprised. His statement had been clean. His exit had not been accessorized with future plans. He had made no request for her attendance at his rebirth. He had, finally, learned the difference between apology and advertisement. Work pulled her forward. She spoke at the foundation that had promised to let her refuse the question that wanted to turn her into a lesson. And when someone asked it anyway, clumsily, earnestly, she declined with a smile that didn't humiliate anyone. She met with a group of teenagers who wanted to start a delivery cooperative and drew the first map of how such a thing could be lawful and kind. She signed a lease on a small office with cracked plaster and excellent light. She bought a plant as an act of optimism. It did not die. On a Thursday evening that smelled of wet asphalt and faint rosemary, memory's trick, Naomi finished teaching and cut through a block she didn't usually use. In the window of the repair shop, a man in a gray sweater bent over a chassis, shoulders rearranged by concentration. She would have walked past if he hadn't looked up at that exact second, as if someone had called his name across no distance at all. He didn't wave. She didn't either. They held a moment like a coin, saw both faces, and put it back in circulation. Later that week, a link reached her phone, the Foundation's final report. It named Margaret's orchestration unambiguously and described the corrective actions with a cool that avoided cruelty. Ethan's signature did not appear. He was no longer needed for the paperwork of the truth he had already told. Spring deepened. The branches she'd cut for the apartment offered new leaves, a domestic miracle that never learned to be less miraculous. Julian came by with lemon bars and news. "The co-op got their grant," he said. "Also, your talk got passed around. Some people learned a new grammar." She laughed into her tea. "The city will forget again. Then we'll teach again," he said, and did not add that teaching had restored more to her than any vindication could. One afternoon, she found herself on the Riverwalk, not by design. The water carried a brighter sky and more boats. The wind had purpose without edge. On the opposite bank, she saw Ethan with a boy who couldn't have been more than 12. The two of them hunched over a small radio, held together by tape and faith. She watched him offer the boy a screwdriver, then wait, hands still, while the boy tried and failed and tried again. When the radio clicked and a voice, thin as a thread, spoke through it, the boy hooted, pure and surprised. Ethan's head tipped back as he laughed, unhandsome and unguarded. He didn't see her. She didn't call out. She let the sight enter her like air. That night, she stood at her window and thought about the varieties of power. The kind that signs checks, the kind that opens doors, the kind that knows exactly where to place a word in a room so that a harmful sentence never forms. And then the quieter kind, the almost invisible kind. Patience, repair, delight that doesn't demand an audience. She had wanted him to find that kind, not for her, but so that any future they might share would not have to ration tenderness. A week later, she returned to the cafe and found him at the counter, talking with the barista about beans and rain. He saw her and did not stand as if the moment were a stage cue. He simply made room at the bar, as one does for someone who is not an interruption, but an addition to a scene already underway. "Naomi," he said, and the name arrived like a familiar path, not a claim. "Would you sit?" "For a while," she said. She didn't order. He didn't either. They shared the smell of coffee without the obligation to drink it. A couple by the window argued amiably about a crossword. The city shone in the puddles like something learning to speak. "How are you?" he asked, not casually. "Building," she said. "You?" "Learning," he said. "How to be useful without being in charge. How to be forgiven only if I am also forgettable." She looked at him. "You don't have to erase yourself to earn a place." "I know," he said. "I'm practicing filling less space so more things can fit." They talked about small matters, the kids at the center, a book she loved, the way radios tempt memory. When silence arrived, it was companionable. At last he said, "I don't know if there's a version of the future where I deserve to be beside you. I only know I'm trying to become a person who would not ask you to become less in order to stand there." "I see that," she said, "from afar and from here." They did not draft terms. They did not promise tomorrows. He walked her to the door and did not reach for her hand. She stepped into the afternoon and didn't look back to measure his expression. Redemption, she considered as she crossed the street, is not a spotlight. It's the lamp you switch on in a room you finally decided to live in. From the corner, the cafe window held two reflections for a second, hers and his, near but not fused, the distance a kindness that allowed both outlines to remain intact. In the days that followed, they met sometimes and sometimes not. He kept showing up where his hands were needed more than his name. She kept choosing work that sharpened her without hardening her. If longing visited, they acknowledged it with a smile and let it sit, a quiet guest who knew how to mind itself. The city warmed, lost patience, cooled again. On a bridge they both knew, weather divided itself without instruction. And somewhere beneath the surface, a current named trust resumed, not as spectacle, but as the steady movement of water that has found, after rock and winter, a path. The day remembered how to rain, not the old, punishing downpour that blurred the skyline into a single sorrow, but a hush, threads of silver drawn across the city with a patient hand. Chicago's buildings softened at the edges. The river darkened into velvet. Footsteps slowed on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Umbrellas opened like small private chapels. The weather made space. Naomi came without deciding to, or perhaps the decision had been working in her for weeks. Quietly, the way green works in a branch before anyone sees it. She walked the same stones she had walked months ago, when grief spoke louder than traffic, and a stranger's voice had divided the storm in two. Her coat carried the faintest memory of rosemary. Her palms remembered the shape of a rail that had once held a complicated breath in place. He was there before she saw him, just a human outline at the parapet, rain knitting itself between shoulder and sky. No entourage, no posture of consequence. A gray sweater, a face that had learned the economy of expression. He didn't move when she approached. He didn't perform recognition. He let it happen, like weather. "Hi," she said, and the word arrived with more history than sound. Ethan turned. The look that passed between them did not pretend the bridge was the same, or that they were. It carried the weight of what had been broken, and the lighter, stubborn fact of what had been built since, separately, haltingly, in rooms without microphones. They smiled, not to make the moment gentler, but because the moment allowed it. "You found me," he said. "I kept the map," she answered. They stood side by side, a modest span of air between their sleeves. The rain softened their hair and reminded the city to listen. A boat passed beneath, an odd, cheerful shape, carrying strangers who pointed at things and narrated each other's delight. Above, the traffic hissed the way a loaf of bread hisses when you pull it from the oven, insisting it is alive. "How is your radio?" she asked. "Obstinate," he said, and grinned with the unguarded, unhandsome warmth she'd once seen across a riverwalk. "But it speaks when coaxed." "And you?" "Same," she nodded. "Me too." Silence, the good kind, arrived, carrying a small table and two chairs. They sat in it without apology. The weeks since they had last met had been work, statements and interviews done, then refused. Old boards dissolved and smaller rooms assembled. A community kitchen that now ran so smoothly it no longer needed his hands, which was the point. She had opened her office and hired two women who liked contracts and laughter in equal measure. Their lives no longer orbited each other. They had learned, instead, to meet where their orbits crossed and not demand the sky rearrange itself in tribute. "What now?" he asked at last, not because the moment required a plan, but because humility had trained him to ask. "Now," Naomi said, "we don't pretend the past is gone." He accepted that, as a student accepts a theorem that has survived every proof. "We don't," he agreed. "And," she added, "we don't let it drive." Rain collected on the rail in a bright, obedient line. He watched a drop plump, shiver, then fall. The smallest leap of faith gravity asks of water. "I can live by that," he said. A couple edged past them under a shared umbrella, laughing at something that had just misbehaved in a tender way. The sound didn't puncture the moment, it gave it scale. This was not a romance at the center of the city or the century. It was two people on a bridge, choosing not to lie to each other about difficulty. "I won't carry your name," Naomi said, "when a room tries to make it heavier than my own. And I won't ask you to," he said. "If a room gets small, we'll step out of it, together or separately, until we can breathe." "I won't be a symbol," she continued. "I want you," he said. "Not a symbol. I want you," she answered. "Not a performance." Across the river, a gust wrinkled the water into 100 bright frowns, and then smoothed them. The world is always rehearsing and recovering. Ethan reached into his bag and drew out an umbrella, the old one, its fabric newly stitched at the seam that once leaked. He opened it and did as he had the first night, angled it to spare her shoulder and not his. She looked at the tilt, at the familiar tenderness made deliberate this time, and then took the handle from him. She lifted it so it covered them both. "Equal," she said. "Equal," he repeated. She turned her palm, a small, sovereign gesture, and he placed his hand in it, not to be saved, but to be met. The contact held everything that had come before and the instruction for what should come next. No sudden claims, no borrowed grandeur, warmth, weight, will. They didn't talk about forgiveness. Forgiveness had been learning to walk in a straight line without stepping on each other's shadows. They didn't script a future. Futures resent scripts. They named the next smaller things. Dinner where the ceiling is low and the owner knows the names of the chairs. Sundays that involve radios and fire escapes, and the refusal to narrate every joy. The satisfaction of saying no to invitations that confused audience with love. A taxi honked from the bridge's far end. Somewhere, a child demanded a story with terrible timing and perfect authority. Naomi laughed. Ethan did too. The sound braided itself with the rain and lay over the water like a ribbon. "We'll fail at this," she said softly. "Sometimes." "Yes," he said. "We'll say so. We'll rest. We'll repair. One step at a time." "One step," he echoed, as if testing a stair. They began to walk, not because the scene needed movement, but because they did. The umbrella made its small country over their heads. When a puddle surprised them, they navigated it together and didn't congratulate themselves for grace. Wind came and went. A train stitched the far sky to the near. At the midpoint, they stopped without plan and looked out, at the river committed to forward, at the city willing, for once, to be blurred. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "The static?" she teased. "The voice in it," he said. She listened. The rain had a voice, yes. So did restraint, and choosing, and the quiet courage of not demanding guarantees. She squeezed his hand once, light as punctuation. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he answered, a word like an open door. They descended the bridge on the side that would lead them through a block of stores that hadn't decided yet what to sell, past a cafe that remembered old songs, toward a street where lights preferred to be warm. The past followed as far as the parapet, then sat down on the stone and watched them go, acknowledged, undismissed, no longer in charge. And because stories are sometimes permitted a sign without requiring a miracle, the rain thinned as they reached the first corner, not stopping, just softening into a bright, generous mist. She tipped the umbrella back to feel it on her face. He did too. They smiled at the unnecessary symmetry and kept walking. If this ending left a gentle ache, if you felt the quiet bravery of choosing again, please like this chapter. Share a comment about your favorite moment from Naomi and Ethan's journey, and follow the channel for new stories and behind-the-scenes notes. Your support helps these echoes find new hearts.